Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our Grand Round speaker for today. Dr. William Brady is an assistant professor of management and organizations at Kellogg School of Management. Dr. Brady earned his BA in psychology and philosophy with distinction from UNC Chapel Hill, his PhD in social psychology at New York University, and was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship from the National Science Foundation, where he worked at Yale University. His research examines the dynamics of emotion at the social network level and their consequences for group behavior. His recent work studies how human psychology and AI-mediated social contexts interact to shape our emotions and intergroup attitudes. Combining tools of behavioral science and computational social science, his research aims to develop person-centered and design-centered interventions to improve our digital social interactions. Dr. Brady's research has been published in leading journals such as PNAS, Nature Human Behavior, Science Advances, and Perspectives on Psychological Science. His work has also been featured in popular press outlets including the New York Times, BBC, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal. In recognition of his contributions, he has been selected for the Association of Psychological Science Rising Star Award and the SAGE Emerging Scholar Award. We are very lucky to be learning from Dr. Brady today on the timely and relevant topic, algorithm-mediated social learning in online social networks. Please drop any questions in the Q&A for after the presentation and join me in welcoming Dr. Brady.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. Really excited to be here, and let me share my screen. We'll get started. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about algorithm-mediated social learning in the context of online social networks. And I've been thinking about this for several years now, and I want to introduce this topic as it's becoming more and more relevant, I think. And given that we have a presidential election coming up in the US very soon, actually, I thought I would kind of start by motivating this work in the context of politics. I'm a social psychologist by training, and so I tend to think a lot about group interactions and how algorithms mediate those interactions, given that we tend to interact so much. Our social world has really gotten pushed into online spaces more than ever before. And of course, that's something that seems to only be increasing, not going away. So let me start by motivating this like I was talking about. This is a picture of Ronald Reagan. I noticed one of the hospitals at UCLA is named after him. Most of you will recognize Ronald Reagan, but some people might not recognize who is on the left. So this is actually Jerry Falwell, who in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was a leading evangelical Christian pastor. And in fact, he was so influential in the United States that he had the third most popular TV network in the entire country, only behind HBO and Turner. There were actually 20 million households that were tuning in to Jerry Falwell's messaging. And as you can see here, he was buddy-buddy with people who had a lot of power, like Ronald Reagan. And so the thing that I want to think about today to motivate the general theme of this talk is what has the role of media been in shaping group and political discourse? So I introduced Jerry Falwell because in his evangelical programming, which I was very aware of growing up in the Bible Belt in the South in the 80s, he was giving a very specific message. And here's a famous quote from one of his most watched television shows. "We're fighting a holy war. What happened to America is that the wicked are bearing rule. We have to lead the nation back to a moral stance that made America great." You might recognize some of this rhetoric in the past election and our current election. Well, this is a legacy that has really continued. It's a language of outrage stoking and moralization, and it's done specifically with the intent to organize the political right against the political left. And so this legacy, like I said, has continued obviously with Donald Trump, people like Pat Robertson, Rush Limbaugh, hyper-partisan news organizations like Fox News. And the question that I want to think about today, in this digital age where we're really having a lot of interactions on platforms and social media, what role does social media play in this moralization and this outrage stoking compared to what we have seen since at least the 1970s in traditional media. And what I'll argue today is that in many ways, social media is very similar. It's linked to political polarization. It has outrage stoking and moralization that's coming from these political elites and these hyper-partisan organizations who asymmetrically control information flow on the platform. So there's a few very influential figures. But and you see this on social media, like in these examples, but there's some key features of social media that are distinct from traditional media. And I think we have to understand these to start to get a handle on what is the role social media plays in the outrage stoking and the moralization in the context of political polarization really rising in the last 10 years in the US. So one of the things I think we need to do is understand social media as a context of collaborative work. This is a technical term that comes out of the human computer interaction literature. It basically just means that the online information context is one that is more participatory than traditional media. In traditional media, you have information just being broadcasted into a mass audience. But on social media, the same thing happens, that information is broadcasted. But now people are actually active participants in spreading or even adding to that information. So you might find that your friend or someone you have a weak tie connection with is sharing that information. Maybe they're posting their own commentary on that information. And what that tends to introduce is outrage and moralization that's being put out by political elites or maybe hyper-partisan news organization. It makes it more of a social reality. And many of us here in this audience are social scientists, so we know that social influence has a greater influence on behavior than just mere information exposure. So when things start to become a social reality, they start to influence our understanding of social norms, which makes us want to conform. And I'll talk a little bit about that today in some of my empirical work that I'll present. But the key thing about all of this, right, is that people's understanding of the social reality is influenced by content algorithms. And this is something that is unique, that wasn't something that was a factor that was influencing media in the past. If you had an extremely broad definition of algorithms, perhaps you could make an argument that traditional media had some version of that, but obviously not in the way today where we have AI controlled models that are making predictions on what people will like based on previous interactions, et cetera. I'll get more into that in a minute. But basically, I think we're in this really unique situation, unique in the sense of we haven't seen it historically, where you have human machine interaction, human algorithm interaction in the context of morality and politics. And so what I want to talk about today is what are some of the effects at the individual and group level from a social psychological perspective? What should we expect will happen when we have this going on? And maybe it can explain some of the things that we've seen emerging in the context of group interactions that all in all have not gone very well in the past 10 years in the United States. So this is a framework that I'll call algorithm-mediated social learning. And now I want to walk you through the framework to tell you more about what I mean by this term. And then I'll go into some empirical work that looks at some of the consequences of this interaction. So let's start to explain algorithm-mediated social learning by a simple observation. Humans are prodigious social learners. So one of the defining features of our species, at least in terms of how we accumulate knowledge through social learning, is the fact that we're learning through direct feedback, we're learning through observation, we're learning through indirect feedback, reinforcement learning. All of these things basically teach us how to do things in ways that allow us to accumulate knowledge over time. And in fact, culture is fundamentally a product of social learning. And so we wouldn't have human culture if we didn't have our distinct abilities to learn from one another so rapidly. Now, one of the important things about social learning that we know from a lot of work in psychology and other fields is that social learning is actually not something that happens in an entirely accurate way. We actually have a lot of biases built into our social learning, but it turns out these biases end up helping us solve a lot of problems when you look at the history of the human species. So I call these functional biases in social learning because they are biases that skew our attention and our learning towards certain things, but they actually end up being helpful in most cases. So I'll summarize these as talking about context biases and content biases. So we have, for example, a strong bias to learn from prestigious models. So why might it be functional to learn from people who we perceive to be prestigious? Well, it turns out statistically, in most environments, a prestigious person is someone who actually is successful. And so if you learn from successful individuals, it actually saves you a lot of time. It's more efficient because you don't have to go through trial and error all of the mistakes that other people might have made. You can just directly copy the successful person. The same thing is true for in-group members. These are people who have the most direct knowledge of the immediate environment, whether that's physical or social, that's going to be most relevant for you. So it makes sense that we might have an outsized attention or bias to learn from in-group members. Emotional and moral information are content biases in the sense that we have a outsized attention to this type of content. Similarly, it helps us solve problems. So thinking very broadly, emotional information obviously tends to be information that is relevant to our survival. So it helps us to attend to that, especially given that that information tends to be more rare in most environments. The same is true for moral information. It helps us detect cheaters, for example, and it helps us pay attention to the norms of what we should be doing in our society. So really it serves this social survival function. Now, all of these biases are demonstrated to be functional when the environment has this information represented in a way where it's rare. And usually these biases contribute very broadly to collective problem solving and cooperation. And these are the things that help human groups survive over time. So now what I want to do is actually contrast these biases that are baked into our psychology when it comes to social learning to the functions or the goals of content algorithms that get employed on social media platforms. So in contrast to the functions of social learning, content algorithms are designed to capture our attention and to maximize engagement on the platforms. So most of us understand this. Social media platforms have a business model that's predicated on advertising revenue. And how do you increase that? Well, you have people on the platforms and engaging with it. And so right off the bat, we can see that there is a little bit of a problem. And this is a problem that I call functional misalignment. On one hand, you have social learning biases that have evolved over time to promote cooperation and collective problem solving. And on the other hand, you have content algorithms that function to capture attention and keep people on platforms. Now, these aren't inherently at odds. Perhaps a side effect of content of capturing attention could kind of help cooperation. But what I will demonstrate through a couple of studies, and also what I'll argue right now, is that in practice, they're very misaligned. So if you've been paying attention, you might actually predict what is the type of content that in practice will capture our attention and maximize engagement. Well, it turns out that in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of work, including some of my recent work, that actually, if you look at the content that is promoted by content algorithms and that spreads most widely on social media, well, it's all the content that we are biased to learn from that are that help us in some cases engage in more efficient social learning. So what I argue is that content algorithms, they optimize engagement. They've learned that the way that you do that is by exploiting our social learning biases that we all naturally have. And so I like to think of this as a bias toward prestigious in-group moralized and emotion information, which we can call prime information as an acronym to help remember it. So now we can use this introduction to think about the general context of what I call algorithm-mediated social learning. And so let's walk through it real quick. I'll introduce this framework, and then I'll present a couple of empirical studies that look at the outcomes of this process. So as I mentioned, we have these biases to attend to prime information, prestigious in-group moralized emotional information, because of their how they help efficient social learning. algorithms that have this goal of optimizing for attention. Well, in practice, what that means is they amplify this prime information that we're biased to learn from. And where algorithm-mediated social learning really starts to get interesting is the fact that in this environment of human algorithm interaction, both sides are starting to learn from one another. And so what happens is that we actually begin as humans who are prodigious social learners. Remember that content algorithms are not just amplifying prime information, they're amplifying prime information. Think back to my slide about the social reality component that gets built on social media. They're amplifying prime information that is posted by people in our network, or maybe people who we recognize, either a celebrity or someone who is a couple degrees removed from our social network. And that starts to demonstrate to us what is actually more normative in our online social network. And so the processes of social learning kick in, and we actually learn to post more of this prime information because of what we're observing. Of course, this isn't true for everyone, but I'll talk about some of these things that predict when it kicks in and when it doesn't. But anyway, the idea is that you actually end up with a situation where prime information gets overrepresented in the online information ecosystem. And what I'll argue is that this actually leads to two outcomes that are very relevant to the context of group interaction. And I'll focus today on the context of politics. It leads to more conflict than we'd otherwise expect. And it also leads to misinformation. What I'll argue is that misinformation actually rides the coattails of this whole process, because it can exploit this process to spread widely, even though most people can recognize when something is blatantly false versus true. These processes start to skew that ability to discern. Okay, so I now want to go into an empirical study that I did on Twitter a couple of years ago that started to look at some of the outcomes of this process where prime information gets overrepresented. And I'll be focusing specifically on an emotion called moral outrage. Many of us are familiar with moral outrage these days. Moral outrage is an emotion that is typically described as a mixture of anger and disgust. It is elicited by very specific conditions. It's when we think that someone or some event has transgressed against our sense of right and wrong. So something morally wrong has occurred. And usually when you have moral outrage, it means you want to hold someone accountable. You want to punish them. And I'll be focusing on moral outrage as a test case because, as you can see, it actually covers a broad swath of some of these categories of prime information. It tends to be very related to in-group, out-group context. Obviously, it's moralized, and it's a emotional component to it. So I'll tell you about this Twitter field study I did a couple years ago. And what we're looking at here is the extent to which moral outrage gets overrepresented in the environment, and what are some of the perceptual processes that might feed into that. So this was a field study that we conducted in a couple of phases. First, we identified two topics that we expected to have moral outrage expression several years ago. So this study was actually conducted during the US Supreme Court confirmation hearings for different things. And so this was in late 2020, before the US election. We also collected election topics as well. And so what we're doing is we're actually using a machine learning classifier we built. I call it the digital outrage classifier. And we can classify automatically Twitter messages that contain moral outrage expression. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about more details about how we develop that and how we validate its accuracy. It actually turns out it works really well because there are pretty universal features of moral outrage that are readily detectable in text. So we have this research pipeline where we're looking at people as they're talking about the Supreme Court confirmation hearing. So I believe this was when, so this was like from 2018 to 2020. So let's see. Oh yeah, Amy Coney Barrett was getting confirmed in the Supreme Court confirmation. And also there were topics about US presidents before the 2020 election. So we're measuring these conversations on Twitter. Then we predict some users who are expressing outrage. We measure their messages. And then in real time, we actually message these users in the field. And we asked them, we basically said, hey, we noticed that you expressed some feelings about this topic. Could you actually tell us how outraged are you when you express your message here? And then the participants would reply using this very simple scale where we're asking about their outrage and their happiness. Happiness was a control, which I'll explain in a minute. And then the cool part about this study, this pipeline, is we actually then take all those messages that we collected in this field study, and then we feed them into observers. And we actually have observers give their perception. How outraged do you think that this message author was when they're tweeting about these confirmation hearings or the US presidential primaries that were going on? And so basically, for the first time, this method allows us to estimate the extent to which there could be a discrepancy between an author's feelings that they're reporting and how the message is viewed or perceived by observers. And this allows us to get at, are people over perceiving outrage in the context of these political topics? So I'll present some of the key results first, and then some follow-up analyses we did to try to dig more into the effects. Well, first, what I want to show you is a simple plot that shows the outrage ratings that are either reported by the authors, which is on your left, or reported by observers. Now, it's important to note that these ratings, whether they're from the observers or the authors, it was all on the same scale. And I'll be plotting raw outrage scores on the left. So these are the literal scores reported by the authors. And then in the observer side, I'll be showing you averages of they're all raw data points, and it's either from the observers or the authors, and I'll explain more in a minute. But first, what you can see is that there is systematic overperception of outrage when we're looking at message authors compared to observers. So in other words, observers think that the authors are more outraged than the authors themselves are reporting to be. And these were the first results of this field study, where we saw evidence that, okay, there's something going on in the social media context where outrage seems to be getting overrepresented, and it seems to be partially something about how observers are viewing these messages. And one important thing to note, if anyone is into understanding distributions, this pool of authors were actually split between half of them our classifier predicted express outrage, half of them didn't. And so that's why you see these two ends of the distribution here full of a lot of responses. But what we see is observers, even if you ignore the messages that were not expressing outrage, so if you just select on messages where authors said they're expressing some amount of outrage, we still see this overperception. So there's something happening across the board, and specifically to moral outrage. Now, the reason why we measure happiness, again, speaking of specificity, is because we also wanted to see, is there just some general effect where people are inaccurate when they're observing the emotions and they have to perceive them? Or is it something specific to outrage? So the first way we looked at that was just by looking at the same effect for happiness. But it turns out we don't see any evidence of overperception of happiness. So there seems to be something selective about moral outrage, or at least about negatively valenced emotion, because we didn't test other negative emotions here. Now, we were able to replicate this effect identically, nearly, in 3 different field study deployments where we're looking at different moral topics in 3 different time points. So this is a very robust phenomenon, and it suggests that there is something going on where outrage gets overrepresented and people are overperceiving how upset people are. Now, in a follow-up test, one of the questions that comes to mind early is, what are some of the individual differences from these perceivers that might explain the tendency for them to overperceive? And we tried a lot of different things. This was totally exploratory, but one of the most robust predictors turned out to be the social media use to learn about politics. So another way to say this is that the more you are someone who goes on social media daily to learn about politics, the more likely you are to overperceive outrage from individuals. And there are a lot of things that could explain this. Is just a general correlation. And I'll talk about some experiments in a second where we start to probe some of these processes. But one of our early reactions to this was probably what's going on is that there are priors getting formed about how intensely people express outrage if you're on social media for the purpose of learning about politics. And basically, what happens is your priors are informing your judgment of anyone's outrage. And so there starts to become a perceptual bias from things you've learned in your social environment, where again, moral outrage tends to be overrepresented. So I think this is some early evidence of this social learning process that is kicking in here. Now, I want to tell you about some follow-up experiments where we're looking to see if you have people in this information ecosystem that are over perceiving moral outrage, what actually happens at the social network level. So why should we care if these individuals are over perceiving outrage? And so what we did in this case is use these mock social media feeds where we have full control over what we could call the algorithm of the feed. So we're manipulating the news feed, upranking certain content over others. And then we're going to see how does it impact collective judgments of outrage and other intergroup judgments. So let me tell you a little bit about this methodology. So we brought political partisans into an experiment, and they were using this mock social media feed that we designed for the study. More or less, it just replicates what Twitter looks like. You can scroll up and down and like things. And so we had two conditions. Let's call one the high overperception condition, where we're actually showing them Twitter messages that were more likely to be overperceived, which we know by looking at the discrepancy between authors and observers in those field studies that I just told you about. So basically, we're making this rule that if a message is overperceived, it has a greater likelihood of showing up in this feed. So it's almost as if an algorithm upranking is going on, is one way to look at that. And then we had another simulated feed where it's the opposite. It's actually the messages that were most likely to be accurately perceived in our field studies. So the only thing that's varying here, importantly, is the overperception factor, because we actually match the author level of outrage for both of the conditions. So what we know is that authors, when you look at the average outrage reported by authors in each of the feeds, it's actually matched. But the only difference is we're getting these messages that tend to be overperceived in one compared to the other. So what happens when we expose people to different feeds? We give them this collective judgment task where we ask, well, how morally outraged do you think members of your social network are? So do we see that there's group level inferences being made just in virtue of manipulating these feeds? And it turns out we get very large effects in the sense that if you were in the high overperception condition, perhaps unsurprisingly, you perceive the network outrage to be higher. But I think what is especially interesting here from the context of someone who works both at the group and the individual level, if you look at the overperception factor, which we can average by looking at our field study data, actually, when you're asking people to make group level judgments at the social network level, they're even more biased than they were when they're estimating the outrage of individuals. And so there's something about viewing groups of messages or groups of people in a feed that actually exacerbates this bias to overperceived outrage. So perhaps this is even another feature of social media that is skewing some of our group level judgments. We also asked, getting to this topic of social learning, we wanted to know, what might people learn from these networks and how might that learning differ across conditions? What would that actually mean for people? So in another study, and one thing I should mention, these are all pre-registered and these all have open data and code. If you want to, you can check the papers out if you want to look into these data. But basically, we did the same methodology, but now we did a norm task where we're asking people, how socially appropriate would it be to post all these series of new messages that we're showing them to the social network? So we're having them imagine, like, now you're in the network, what are the things you think would be appropriate to post? And what we find is that, and I should also mention, we varied the moral outrage expression in all these new messages that they saw. And we find that people, as we predicted, are significantly more likely to report that moral outrage is appropriate for the social network if they were in that high overperception social media feed compared to the low overperception feed. So the last thing I want to show you is an outcome where we looked at this group level meta judgment of effective polarization, which is another way to talk about political polarization. But here we specifically mean the negative feelings that people have, the affect toward the different political groups. And this is really about social learning. So we're not asking participants, how polarized do you feel? We're asking them to judge how polarized do you think your group is toward the outgroup and the in-group. And so first of all, let me show you the in-group results. What we find here is a notable effect of in-group favoritism. So people who are in the high overperception condition, they think that their social network is more favorable feeling toward the in-group than the out-group, compared to people in a low overperception condition. However, when you look at out-group, so what this is representing is effective polarization. How much do you think that your group dislikes the political outgroup? We actually see that this effect is nearly 2 times as strong. So in other words, people in the high overperception condition think that their social network is more effectively polarized than people who view this low overperception feed. So basically, this overperception bias is amplifying perceptions of effective polarization. And let me now just summarize more generally, because I presented a lot of results, some of these findings, and then I'll put them in context a little more. So what we're finding in this field study is that social media users are systematically over-perceiving how outraged message authors are. This directly leads, we show in these causal experiments, to over-perception of collective outrage at the group level. And overperception of collective outrage ends up amplifying perceptions of outrage norm, so how appropriate you think it is to express outrage, and also effective polarization. So I think this is really important because this is making people think that outrage expression is more normative. It also makes you think that your network dislikes the outgroup more. And of course, that can influence your behavior, especially if algorithms are starting to amplify this general process. So I think these results shed light on some of the emotional processes that can help explain some of the polarization that we see emerging on these platforms. And I think one of the key takeaways is that if these platforms, because of this general process of what I've called algorithm-mediated social learning, if they paint a non-representative picture of how extreme people are or how outraged they are, this can really lead to 2 things. One, it could just lead to conformity, and where people are conforming to a norm that is actually false. This is sometimes called generally pluralistic ignorance. It could also lead to something that has been described as a spiral of silence. And the idea here is that if you perceive a norm to be more extreme than you would personally endorse, you might actually just drop out of that, say, political conversation. And then what happens is that the conversation becomes even less representative, because people who say like, well, this is too outrage ridden for me, they're no longer going to be represented. Okay, so I just want to check my time. I believe I have like 5-6 more minutes, or maybe I have 10 minutes actually. So I'm going to very briefly discuss some results now, thinking about how does how does misinformation exploit algorithm-mediated learning and moral outrage, like what I talked about in the last study, to spread widely in the context of politics. So generally what I'm going to be arguing here, and what I think our data show, is that misinformation is actually just one symptom of a broader problem that stems from this process of algorithm-mediated social learning. And so if we want to understand how to curb misinformation and what our attraction is to it, we actually have to take a step back and not just focus on misinformation itself, but this broader ecosystem where outrage and prime information is getting amplified. So if it's true that misinformation is, is kind of riding through this process, specifically moral outrage, there's a couple hypotheses that should come out in the data. And so I want to walk through 3 of them, and then I'll talk about a 4th as well. So some of these are very simple. if it's true that misinformation is getting a lot of its power from outrage, we should see that it tends to evoke moral outrage than factually accurate news. Also, it should be the case if it's using this to spread that outrage evoking misinformation should receive greater engagement than non-outrage misinformation. And then finally, I'll test whether misinformation evokes moral outrage and other types of emotions. Is this generally a process where misinformation is associated with emotion, or is it something specific to moral outrage? And then the last thing I'll talk about at the end, if I have time, is how being in a moral outrage state, it actually makes social motivations, like things like I was talking about with social learning and conforming to norms, it makes these things more salient than accuracy motivations, these motivations we have to engage with things that are true rather than false. And this actually turns out to be important because my data and other researchers' data have shown that if you really ask people and you prompt them, we're pretty good at discerning real versus fake news, even in an AI generated fake news ecosystem. The problem is we're not always in that mindset. And in fact, I argue that social media and also outrage put us in a mindset that tends to be more about social motivations we care about. So let me quickly walk through some of the methodology of this study. It was actually a very big effort. I'm calling these study 1 and study 2, but actually there's 3 studies in each of them. So really it's a total of 6 studies over several years of data and several different operationalizations of misinformation. So we were able to collect data from Twitter over a 10-year period. I'll talk mostly today about data that come from the 2016 US election and the 2020 US election. And we have both a population of data of URLs that were explicitly sent from the Internet Research Agency, which was a Russian misinformation farm, basically. So we know the domains they sent. We can use those URL domains. We also have another list of non-IRA URLs. And by pulling these known databases together, we actually can classify at the domain level which domains were misinformation, which tend to be more trustworthy, more factually accurate. We also were able to get access to the same time frame and same domains using Facebook data, working with their group. And by the way, I have a lot of thoughts about doing academic industry collaboration. If anyone wants to chat more about it, there's some pros and there's definitely some cons. But then we're able to actually collect responses when people were exposed to these domains, these news links. How are they responding in comments, for example, or in retweets? We also have the same information for Facebook/Meta, although in this case, we're looking at the emotional reactions that they post in response to these links, these URLs, these domains. So then in the Twitter data set, we use that outrage classifier that I talked about to classify the outrage in the comments. That way we know how outraged were these URLs making people on average. And then in the Facebook data, we look at the count of angry emotions, and then we can compare those to the other types of emotional reactions that are available. So the first hypothesis was frequency. And we find very robust evidence that on Twitter, misinformation links are eliciting about 2 times more moral outrage than factually accurate news links. And we see this in both time periods that I'll be focusing on today. And we replicate this with the Facebook data, although the effects are a little bit smaller. We also, in the context of Twitter, we can see this both with conversation tweets. So when you're replying to people, or you can look at when people share a URL and write their own commentary. You see this effect for both of those types of interactions. For the engagement hypothesis, we also see consistent effects with our predictions. We see that what we're showing here is that the more outrage that these URLs were eliciting, the more likely those URLs are actually to be shared in general. And obviously, we're adjusting for the base rate of interaction here when we're estimating the proportion of outrage and engagement. So we actually find, interestingly, that factually accurate news also shows the same pattern. So this is again suggesting that misinformation is spreading by eliciting moral outrage, but this is something that generally happens in the information ecosystem. The problem is, and I should mention we replicate this on Facebook, the problem is though, that going back to my previous slide, misinformation tends to evoke more outrage. And so if it's more consistently evoking outrage, then this engagement pattern is going to be even more relevant to misinformation. Okay, we also were looking in the Facebook data at specificity. So we're actually able to estimate the effect of angers when you're looking at misinformation reactions compared to factually accurate news reactions. And we see that anger is the strongest predictor, or is most, I should say, is most strongly associated with misinformation compared to factually accurate news. You also see that the ha-has, or the kind of smiley you can put, or I should say it's like a laughing icon if you've used Facebook in a while. And basically I actually think what this is people making fun of some of the content. So actually, in a way, some people use this to express outrage or making fun of the content. So the last thing I'll mention, and then for the last like 3 minutes, I want to talk about some interventions I've been thinking of for dealing with this general process. But let me just go through this very quickly. We did a behavioral experiment where we collected different articles. We actually pilot tested them because some of them were more outrage evoking than others. Some were about political figures in the outgroup doing things. We actually know on average how outrage evoking each of the news articles are. We show participants outrage versus neutral articles, and we show real versus fake news. These are all fact checked as real versus fake. So now this is at the article level. And then we either ask them to share the article, how likely would you be to share it, or to actually just make an accuracy judgment. And going back to what I said earlier, are people actually good at discerning real versus fake news? Turns out they are. We see decent significant effect. People think fake news is less accurate. That's great. And it turns out moral outrage, how much the article evoked outrage, had no bearing on how accurate people were in discerning. And so you might think that's a little puzzling. How does outrage have this effect if it's not through discernment? Well, it turns out as soon as you ask people to share rather than just think about the accuracy, now outrage makes people significantly more likely to share fake news. And it also made people in general more likely to share news, but the effect is strongest for moral outrage, for misinformation. And so what you're finding here, like I said before, the way that we interpret this is moral outrage is putting people in this motivational state where they're going to share content, even if theoretically we know that they could say, actually, that's fake. But when they're thinking about sharing, especially when they're outraged, they're more likely to share that content. So just to summarize, I've argued and shown some indirect evidence for so far that algorithm-mediated social learning leads to overrepresentation of prime information. Misinformation spreads by exploiting our biases toward that prime information. In this case, I've been talking about moral outrage. And so if we want to combat misinformation holistically, I think we have to start considering what is the goal and how should content algorithms be designed. Maybe they shouldn't be designed to exploit our natural attention biases. I'll talk about this in a minute, and we could also talk about that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. I think there's also value to educate people about how algorithms can impact our social learning. For example, impact how outraged we think other people are and how outraged our groups are. But I'm not going to talk about that today. Let me do just 2 quick slides on actually why it's really difficult to think about in general. What do you do about outrage or polarizing content that gets overrepresented? If we're just talking about misinformation, I just want to make a couple of points here. Actually, these interventions are pretty obvious what we should be doing. We all agree, let's reduce information. Let's get rid of that stuff. When it comes to outrage and polarization or polarizing content, actually, it's not clear that we should be getting rid of this content. What I argue is that, yes, outrage does tend to be artificially amplified, and that process in and of itself is bad. But outrage, for example, is something that helps us pay attention to moral issues we really should be caring about. And in the context of a society that has a lot of inequality like the US, actually it helps sometimes lower power groups challenge the status quo by expressing outrage, by getting people on board, like finding allies to care about these issues. we've obviously seen cases like Black Lives Matter or Me Too movement try to leverage this, arguably in successful ways. So the idea of just getting rid of this content isn't great. And if you don't know what the goal is, and you want to design an algorithm to try to fix this problem, it's actually really difficult because you don't know what you're supposed to be optimizing on. And so I have a couple of ideas for what you should be doing in this case. It's a very difficult problem, one that I would argue is not solved yet, but I have some recent ideas that I would love. Actually, I'll just, if anyone's interested, I'll talk more about these in the Q&A. The answer is not just get rid of prime information, as I've been alluding to. Another thing that people have argued is maybe we just need to make people see more of the other side's content, something that's called diversification. It turns out that actually backfires in the context of politics and a lot of intergroup conflict situations. People will actually, there's evidence on this, get more upset if you just start showing them, say if you're a Republican, you show them Democrat point of views. But the other problem with wholesale diversification is if you are a moderate voter, technically speaking, it would count as diversification to show someone, that person, far-right hate speech. So obviously there's a lot of things that don't make sense in the context of politics. I argue that we should be doing something called, that we should be optimizing on something called bounded diversification. And I don't have time to go into all the details of this, but let me just say at a very high level, we can take some of the problems that I talked about, over representation of prime content, of outrage, of extreme political content. We can actually try to, if you imagine a distribution of extreme content, we should actually try to cut off the far boundaries of those. So cut off the tails of those distributions. And then we can start to do some diversification that really puts like a bound on the diversification, so you don't have weird consequences like exposing people to things that are extreme or things that are actually not representative of what, for example, most Democrats and Republicans think. So we can talk more about that, but that is one thing I've been thinking about a lot. And there are interesting things to think about. How do you design a content algorithm to do that? I'm actually in the process of designing one right now, and we're going to roll out a field study in the 2024 US election. So that's all I have for today. I want to quickly thank some of my collaborators who are social psychologists. And I'll mention we have our digital outrage classifier open source online. You can check it out here. It's free to use. And then a lot of the ideas are summarized in this paper that recently came out in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. So here's a QR code that you could use if you want to check that paper out. But that's all I have. So thanks so much.
All right, wonderful talk, really fascinating. Bunch of questions here for you. Starting off with, hopefully you can talk a little bit more about the development of morality and as it relates to maybe moral outrage. And so in order to have moral outrage, you have to develop a moral compass. And this kind of hints at a little bit of the developmental process and maybe age-dependent effects that you might see. Anything that you've seen in your studies or in the literature to suggest that exposure to moral outrage actually influences the way morality is developed? Or that certain people are more vulnerable to the effects, like in terms of their age, than others?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I have not studied that myself. Let me think about some things that are relevant, although not directly speaking to that question. One of the things we know in the context of misinformation is that the age group most, so this is almost the opposite of your question. The age groups that are most vulnerable to misinformation and share it more are the elderly side of the age distribution. And one of the reasons is, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the main ones relevant to the talk I gave today is that they have low digital literacy compared to younger individuals. And basically what that means is they certainly have they have little awareness. They tend to have less awareness of how algorithms are influencing content and how social media platforms work. They also generally have a lower ability to search the internet to find if something is true versus fake. This is just I think a consequence of not being digital natives like any of us who are millennials or younger are. So yeah, that's kind of like the opposite. There's a really speaking of developmental questions, there's a really big emerging literature now looking at social media use and how it affects teenagers, especially who obviously are basically at one of the most, I guess, socially vulnerable times, right? This is when you're constantly scanning the environment to learn how do you fit in. And it's a really debated literature right now, but the general consensus from studies I've seen is that there is one demographic, teenage women who, teenage girls who are most susceptible to some of these negative effects of social media. They tend to have some effects of depression from increased social media use, and the likely process actually does have to do with social learning. It's kind of doing self comparisons to other people because related to my talk, some content gets overrepresented and people get a false understanding of, say, like how common it is to be someone who has a certain beauty standard, right? So that's some of the consensus in the literature, but I would flag that there's really a lot of debates. It's difficult to estimate, longitudinal effects of social media use in these populations, but that's the current consensus in my read of the literature.
Okay, and going off of that, you mentioned that being exposed to a lot of moral outrage can adjust your norms for moral outrage, which to me also sounds like it can then lead to maybe a numbing effect where it takes more to get them outraged, or is that accurate?
Yeah, so what we find in some of our in a different study I didn't present today is that people certainly will increase their outrage expression over time when they're receiving more social reward online for expressing it. But there is sort of like a limit to that effect. If you're in a social network where there's more outrage being expressed in general, those effects start to diminish. So but unfortunately, the answer is not that people stop expressing outrage, it's that they keep expressing it in a way that's not sensitive to social reward anymore. And if anyone studies like reinforcement learning and habit, it's actually like kind of scary because that's one of the key features of habitized behavior. We haven't demonstrated that that requires a little more controlled testing, that it's a habit per se, but those are some of the effects we see. I would also say that one of the biggest problems that we observe is when people are expressing outrage about a larger number of things, it can become difficult for the social network to decide what they should care the most about. And in some preliminary data right now, where we're looking over 12 years of social media data, we see some really interesting effects where the domain of morality is actually one that shows the most conceptual instability over time on social media. So basically, the way we interpret that right now is that so many things are moving in and out of what should be moralized. It can be difficult sometimes to know, like, what's the thing I should be caring about this week? It can become exhausting for some people.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, another question. This was related to the study that you discussed with the authors and the observers. The question is, how can we know that the authors are rating the same sample of behavior as the observers? Perhaps the authors are rating their overall outrage about the topic rather than how they felt when they wrote that particular message. Was there anything that you did to kind of control for that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, in the message that we send to the users, the authors, we actually tell them specifically to not do that. So we say, um, uh, we want you to think. And by the oh, another important detail, we were able to send these messages within 15 minutes of the author posting that. And in fact, the modal time between author posting and us sending is like 2 minutes or something. So it's very fresh on their mind, and we tell them specifically. Tell us about the outrage you were feeling when you posted this message rather than your general outrage about the topic.
Okay, excellent. Then another question. Dialogue discussion is important for modulating outrage and information synthesis. Can you discuss at all the implications of platform-specific limitations to discussion, or any thoughts you have about it?
Yeah, so I think there are, aside from the whole process I outlined about algorithms, I think there are some other features of the social media environment that can make yeah, like positive conversations difficult. One that has been discussed a lot, for example, on Twitter, is like the short amount of text that you have to try to express your views in. We've also argued that the way that you get social reward delivered in this very quantifiable sense can lead to problems for positive dialogue. And then also, there's a really interesting thing that I've thought about lately, which is something that has been called context collapse. And it's this idea that some of these social media platforms, you often aren't aware of what kind of people are going to see your message. So you craft a message intended for a certain audience, but then all these other people see it. And often that's how like these canceling situations happen, where someone says something with a lot of conversational assumptions in mind about who they are talking to, but it gets taken completely out of context because they forgot, or maybe they weren't aware that it's a more public platform and other people might pick it up. So those are just a couple of features, but there are several that I think could actually be changed to help improve conversations.
Excellent. Okay, last question. Any data or thoughts about the use of emojis in terms of amplifying our perception of outrage?
Yeah, so we do classify certain emojis as a feature that goes into our outrage classification, obviously, like the anger emotion. And so that is a feature in our outrage classification. We have not done a systematic analysis to look at how emojis versus text interact in the context of algorithm amplification, though. That's a really interesting thing to look at, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Given us a lot to think about.
Great. Thanks so much for the questions. And it's great to be here. Feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. Thanks for your attention.
Really appreciate it. Bye.